Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring the challenges of responsible leadership and how to navigate them. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark and the Anti-Greenwash Charter. The article we'll be unpacking this week is China Energy Transition Review 2025 by Sam Butler-Sloss. And our guest today, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to say, is Gib Hedstrom, author, board advisor, and founder of ESG Navigator LLC. For 30 years, Gib has advised Fortune 500 boards and CEOs on sustainability governance and strategy, and his latest book, Navigating Sustainable Growth, a roadmap for boards and corporate leaders, has just been published, fresh off the press. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on today, Gib. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Charlie, great to be here. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Now, Gib, I feel like I've got so many questions for you and your background and your experience, considering all that you've done. But I'm going to start with that sort of slightly more focused one on what you're up to right now. Can you just give us a bit of a flavor as to what the new book covers and perhaps what your hopes and ambitions are with it?
Yeah, great, Charlie. Thanks. Actually, the book is, as you said, it's just been out 2 months, July 21st. And, you write a book and you think once it's published, you can go back to life as maybe it used to be. But I've been completely full with activity related to the book, which is great. Given, I think, 6 talks locally, 4 locally, 2 over in Europe, another podcast, and really excited about reading the news currently and learning from others about the main premise of the book, which is essentially a call to action for corporate leaders and board members, and a belief that we are literally at a fork in the road today, and that the next 5 years will define the future, not just for business, but for our planet, for our portfolios, and our kids. And this current article that we're about to discuss, I think, is a fascinating marker in that journey. So exciting times.
Beautifully done, Gib. I love how you've segued the article in there in a lovely way. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But how did we get here? This is, you're, as I kind of alluded to, a man who's had a very distinguished career and ultimately is now, an author and looking to affect things in a slightly different way. But can you take us back to one of your kind of formative early experiences that you can recall that really helped shape your view of the world and what's ethical and what's sustainable and what you ultimately wanted to then focus your career on?
Yeah, great, Charlie. If I were to pick one event, it was a notable one in my personal life, and it turns out in my marriage. And in 1979, my girlfriend and I hiked the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, and that was a 4+ month journey with very sore feet and kind of slogging along. But it was also a chance to reflect on, my life up until that point. I just quit working at General Electric as a junior financial trainee for 4 years. And it was interesting. I've always kind of had one foot in the environment and one in business, maybe a story of contrast. Part of me is a dreamer, wanting to kind of save the world or do great things in the environment. And the other is a very practical business guy who wants to get on the inside of business and affect change. And at GE, there I was in the middle of accounting pools of people doing work back in the 70s. And it was an eye-opener in a number of ways. Jack Welch, who would be later become CEO of GE, was running plastics at the time in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I learned how the accounting system works at big companies, where when you close the books and you magically end up with the results that end up in those beautiful bar charts that rise year after year with revenue growth and profit growth. I learned some of the inside scoop of how that really works. But notably on the environment, Pittsfield, Mass in 1979 was cold and snowy. And in the month of January, there was a thermometer outside the door of the house I was living in with others. And it was 0 degrees Fahrenheit every morning at 7 a.m. in in January, and I drove up to Pittsfield, Mass, to sign in, if you will, at 8:00, and parked in front of Silver Lake, which never froze. So there I am, looking at this body of water when it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever that is, minus 18 C or something, and it didn't freeze. And it turns out PCB contamination, the large transformer. So all of that was in my history, and walking the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, which, by the way, I'd met my girlfriend. It was her idea. I thought it was crazy, but once it got in my head, I wasn't going to back out. So we had a lot of time to reflect on that. And one last point, Gib,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just for full context here, how old are you at this point in 1979? What?
Oh, in 1979? Well, let's see. So 53, 6, so 36. Sorry, 26. 26. Sorry, 26. Yeah, just youngster.
A youngster, but a young man who's already had a taste of the professional world and of his career, but then to give yourself at that age that opportunity to go and have that significant reflection for that period of time, that's an amazing thing to have been aware to give yourself at that age.
And Charlie, I'd like to say I was aware and gave myself. It was a number of circumstances that came to a head. But it's great advice to offer young folks, as you kind of alluded to. If you're able to get out of college, if you're so inclined and fortunate, and then work for 3 or 4 years, and then hit the pause button and step back. For me, it was notable and great. And I also, one last footnote on that, while I was the later years of GE and really wanted to get into the environmental world somehow, I ran into a mentor who was a true environmentalist. Never met the man, but we exchanged letters. He was an author, and he just came to me in writing and basically said, follow your heart. The things we always hear, right? A little bit trite maybe, but he said, you've obviously been successful. Anything is possible. Go for it. And so quit GE and hike the AT, and here we are.
and I mean, there's so much to unpack that. I just love the idea that you've had a mentor that was about a pen pal. I mean, that's such a brilliant. Again, that's so wonderful to think of it like that. And I wonder how actually, in terms of that experience of mentoring, how receiving guidance in the form of a letter, how different that is to, how more deeply sort of integrated and reflective you might have been on receiving it in that form as opposed to an email or, conversation online or whatever, where it seems a bit more fleeting. It's interesting in that sense. But on the pilgrimage, as I'm going to refer to it as, what were the lessons? What were the key insights that you learned as a 26-year-old man going and doing that? Like, what did you sort of leave with, if you like?
So prior to hiking, and by the way, when we were packing up, it was talk about a study in contrast. I was working at GE, the pillar of industrial society, and I was living 6 miles away in a Massachusetts Audubon sanctuary where I was the caretaker, and my girlfriend and I, Peg and I, now married for 45 years, were teaching the cross-country ski program. And so prior to the hike, I left GE and I applied to graduate school, partly through the advice of this author. His name was Sigurd Olsen. He was 82 years old. He was wrote books about the environment. And so I applied to the University of Michigan in the School of Natural Resources. Today it is called Sustainability, and the business school. And so I was about to launch into kind of the joint career with one foot in environment and one in business at the University of Michigan. So as I was hiking the AT, it was a very exciting time to kind of leave one chapter behind, look forward to the next one with that dual focus.
Fascinating. Well, look, I feel like we could do a whole show in unpicking the various different experiences that you had along the hike. But I should say, for any of our listeners and viewers that want to check out the full Gib's story. We'll obviously be linking to his LinkedIn profile for you guys to go and do a deep dive, which I would highly recommend because there's a lot of really interesting pivots and turns along the way. But for now, Gib, can we move on to this week's article? Would you mind just sort of briefly summarizing and introducing the piece for our listeners?
Sure, Charlie. Yes. So the title is China Energy Transition Review 2025. And as you mentioned, it's got three authors of the study, one of which who you name for the article itself. It's a 57-page article, but which sounds ominous, but full of graphs and charts and easy to take away visuals. And I found the article fascinating because to the point I made earlier about the premise of my book saying we're at a critical point in time and a fork in the road. There's so much depressing news out there, and certainly in this country about the pace of renewables and everything else, but globally with everything we read. And to me, this article was the most interesting, impactful, and I would say exciting one for anybody who cares about the state of the planet for our kids and grandkids that I'd read in a long time. And it basically, the article basically described how China is going gangbusters on EVs and renewables in the clean tech economy, and essentially saying that China's clean energy transition is fundamentally reshaping the economics of energy globally. And there are twin trends that the article talks about. One is the accelerating deployment of renewables, wind, solar, EVs, et cetera. And the second is simultaneously the electrification of the core end markets and uses of energy. So those two kind of twin trends are all illustrated, as I said, in lots of graphs and charts, and fascinating piece.
Super well summarized and introduced. I should say, it is a lengthy piece, but as you say, for anybody that wants to sort of dive into the depths, we'll obviously be linking to it. But Gib's very much giving you the headline, if you like. There, Gib, when you read this, and with your knowledge and understanding of how things operate on a global scale, were you surprised by this, or were you clear on China's commitment and that this was something that was going on in the background, or was there something in this that you were surprised by?
I was surprised, Charlie. And in hindsight, the more I've read the article and other pieces, I guess I should not have been surprised, but I truly was surprised by the pace and scale and impact of what has been happening. And I think the easiest way to imagine it is the old S curve, right? Where any new technology or whatever business maybe starts very slowly, slow progress, and then all of a sudden hits its stride. And this article is about China's clean energy portfolio right at the slope of the S curve that's shooting up. And I didn't, you hear little bits and pieces, but this article pulled a lot of it together for me, and that was very interesting.
And out of interest, getting into, because I guess one of the things that I took from the article was very much thinking about, well, what are the conditions at play in China that are allowing this kind of acceleration, as opposed to perhaps the conditions at play in other parts of the world? If you were to look at, and I know the article alludes to this, if you were to look at kind of the key environmental characteristics, if you like, that are allowing this transition to gain the kind of pace that it is, what are they?
Yeah, it's interesting, Charlie. I mentioned one mentor. I had an earlier mentor in college who was a geology professor, and I ended up double majoring in geology and economics. I started as economics. A key part of the history here is geology. China is a country that is rich in a lot of things, but oil is not one of them. And obviously for me, sitting in the U.S., which has been oil rich, it's easy. And China also, of course, is rich in coal. So for 25 years, many of us in the U.S., myself included, kind of look across the Pacific at China and think, man, these guys are just burning dirty coal like crazy, smog, horrible air quality. And then you read this article and think, wow, part of it maybe gets to a further question of yours is what's really going on here in China. The article point is squarely about the clean tech industry and how it came to pass, which I think is a really interesting story, and where it is today. But what that the history is kind of grounded in that rich in coal, weak, little oil, and therefore needing to import oil. And so the whole renewables business is one that was perhaps more of a natural result for China than some other countries.
It's fascinating that even, when we talk about sustainability in both macro and I guess more applied, individual organizational cases, we often, come back to, well, what is the real driver here behind this? And you've just alluded to, I think, the very practical, real driver, which is interesting. What are the implications of this worldwide? Or, for example, I know you're US based. What are the implications of this speeding of the transition for the US?
I think the implications for the US are massive because, and by the way, just to add a bit more flavor to the China history, and I think the article alludes to this. China's famous for planning ahead, right? And the US is not. We're proving that every day. China so if we go back to 2012 or 2013, China had horrible air quality and building coal plants like crazy. And Chairman Xi declared a war on air pollution, and the result over 10 years was driving down particulate pollution by 40 or 50%. And President Xi also the next year essentially launched a 10-year roadmap to dominate the clean technologies dominate the winning technologies of the future, one of which is energy. And so in 2015, they launched a 10-year plan to win the technologies of the future. And I didn't really see that. I'm not sure people in the U.S. did. And so I think many in the U.S. have kind of had this mental image of China as the dirty coal guys, and perhaps not seeing that they have been marching down this 10-year roadmap. And suddenly, as this article says, we wake up today and they are dominating wind and solar. 80% of the world's solar, 60% of the world's wind, 50% of the electric vehicles, and 50% of the cars sold last year in China were EVs. 4 years earlier, it was 6%. So to the S curve, they're just shooting up the S curve. And other countries are paying notice of that. So to the U.S., I'd be scared, scared that all of a sudden we're just on the wrong vector here.
I was going to say it's almost like, getting to the stage where the timeline or the road, if you like, that China are traveling on is the one that the US is no longer traveling on, and there's a sense of just being left completely behind in that view. You've alluded to it there in terms of the application of long-term thinking and planning going back to 2013, 2015, and then looking at the implications of that 10 years or so down the line. Just talk to me about the role of removing the short-term 3-year cycle, if you like, of most boards that, I'm not talking about governments and boards interchangeably here, but essentially the short-term thinking of those in powers that seems to be the modus operandi for, the Western democracies versus perhaps the more long-term thinking of other parts of the world. Just touch on that for you. I know it features in your book. It'd be great to hear your view.
Yeah, and when I was writing the book, I wanted to appeal directly to very busy senior execs, boards, CEOs, C-suite execs, board members who don't have a lot of time, and that's why the book is only 165 pages and has a short appendix on the climate story. But it was interesting. In writing the book, I ran across McKinsey research. And of course, every CEO loves McKinsey. McKinsey research proves that companies that, and these are, I think, mostly US and European companies that plan and execute over a 5 to 7 year horizon significantly outperform their peers over the extended time. And their time frame is, I think, 15 years. And the company they studied, I can't remember the exact number, but more than 400 major companies. And they outperformed by almost 50%. So you would think the logic suggests, hey, this is an obvious thing. All we got to do is plan and execute over 5 to 7 years, and we're going to win in the marketplace. But as you just said, the median tenure of S&P 500 CEOs is 4.8 years. The strategic planning horizon of U.S. companies almost entirely, and I've had these 60 webinars or so the last 6 or 7 years of many Fortune 500 companies, and we share lots under the Chatham House rules. So what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And they say, listen, our strategic planning horizon is 1 to 3 years. We don't look out more than that. And so that's the dilemma, Charlie, and the contrast. McKinsey says 5 to 7 years. China's proving that 5 to 10 years. And, the Western businesses are kind of stuck in this 1 to 3 year world. And with that, I mean, is it too simple? I mean, again, you've brilliantly spoken about the kind of natural pressures, if you like, on China on the basis of being coal rich and oil poor, of the circumstances that they found themselves in leading to focusing on this. But then the catalyst for this focus to realize a real outcome is to have that long-term perspective applied to policy and attention and drive and decisiveness, if you like, around achieving that outcome. What lessons beyond, right, we now need to all start thinking into that kind of 5 to 7 year frame? Like, what other lessons can be drawn from the China case study? Is it just as simple as be more decisive, be more long-term, or are there other kind of more nuanced insights that can be gleaned? Well, Charlie, I think one of the interesting things, or most interesting things that I took away from the piece is not so much whether there was anything wrong or misleading or otherwise. And on the contrary, I thought it was richly researched by very credible, a very credible firm and people. But I was craving to understand the rest of the story, right? So we read about all the great things that China has done the last 10 years and is doing today in the renewables and clean tech space. But I found myself asking, what's going on with coal, right? I mean, what's going on today with air quality? And I did just a little bit of digging on that. And I mean, China is still building coal capacity this year. They have more than 6 times the number of or the volume of coal and coal capacity of any other country in the world. India's a very distant second, and U.S. a distant third. So China, I mean, they have more than 1,000 coal plants. And yes, the air quality seems to be better from everything I read, but what's missing from the article is kind of where's the balance and where's this going from here? It tells half of the story on the renewables. They're still building coal capacity. They have closed, I think, 150 of the 1,000 or 1,200 coal plants since 2000. So they're decommissioning older, dirtier ones, I think. But you kind of left wondering, okay, what's the full story here?
And that, Gib, that's really well observed, I think, in the piece from my perspective as well. But I suppose it comes back to your previous point about like how you felt about this article as a whole, which is that, almost surprised sort of optimism that comes from, wow, look at the speed and the decisiveness of change that's occurring here. And presumably, I mean, it's disheartening to hear that there are new coal plants being commissioned and developed even now. But if this transition is still occurring as quickly as it is, then that gives us the green shoots, if you like, that perhaps this might affect not only China, but if China gets things right on this sort of scale in the way that it is, then the implications to the rest of the world are significant too. Would that be a fair sort of overarching observation?
No, I think so. I think absolutely fair. And, China's the pivot country here, right? Because 50% of the growth of energy demand in the last 10 years, growth of fossil fuels the last 10 years has been China. So they've been the ones driving up fossil fuel consumption. And meanwhile, OECD and even U.S. Countries have been declining. And so China is the pivot country here. And as they kind of, mixing metaphors, but as they climb up the S curve and rapidly deploy renewables and rapidly electrify the end use markets, buildings, industry, and transport, then all of a sudden the rest of the world is following suit. And there's a statistic, I believe in the article, that 25% of the emerging economies have leapfrogged the U.S. in terms of renewables and in electrification deployment. And so China, and the other thing that's happening here is China's capacity, the capacity they built in batteries and solar and wind far exceeds, as I read, what's needed to achieve the Paris Agreement target. So they got this huge capacity, which means they're driving down the cost, which means for emerging markets, it's cheaper for them to simply follow China's lead, import their EVs, import their grid technology, battery technology, than it is in many cases to follow the old route.
And that, I think, is what is ultimately the optimism for me that comes from the piece is what are the implications of this continuing over the course of the next 5 years? Is this going to be a significant pressure, if you like, or facilitator, if you like, of wider adoption in some of those emerging economies? Gib, let me ask you a question. I want to take you back slightly to your point about boards and their frame of reference when it comes to strategic planning. What have you noticed in all of your sort of career, and perhaps this might allude to some insights in your latest book, but what are the commonalities that you see in organizations that are able to adopt this longer term view? Like, what do they look like? Like, what makes them able to do so?
Yeah, let me first mention a comment about boards. I lived in Brussels for 2 years when I worked at Arthur D. Little. I worked at Arthur D. Little after GE and after graduate school. I was at Arthur D. Little for 20 years, ran environmental auditing in the U.S. during the 80s explosion of virtually every major company instituting an environment, health, safety audit program. Then I ran our activities in Europe for a few years and lived in Brussels for 2 of those years in the mid-90s. And I learned that across the pond, you and your colleagues use the word board differently than in the U.S. So in the U.S., the board is strictly the supervisory board that sits on top of a company. And in Europe, as I understand it, we have both the supervisory board and the management board. And the terms are used, the word board is used both ways, right? And so I'll answer your question.
I must apologize for making things incredibly confusing.
No.
You carry on.
It's fascinating, and a lot of what one reads in the U.S. where the word board is mentioned without that distinguishing feature may cause a little confusion. But answer your question. There aren't many companies in the U.S., major companies, that I would say are great proof points of the longer term planning, with one key exception. Privately held firms versus publicly held firms. I did a podcast on the book with the the publisher and interviewed Jennifer Aspen Mason, who's the executive vice president and chief sustainability officer of J.M. Huber, and which is a 160-year-old family company. And it was just fascinating to hear her talking about the company. And she had previously worked with Mars, also privately held, and before that with Unilever. So she'd had the privilege of working with three amazing global companies, all of which were very values-based and long-term planning based. And that's quite different than the typical U.S. company. One notable exception for publicly held companies is Trane Technologies. Many may not have heard of the company, TRANE, not the ones that go on tracks. It's an HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning company that set a gigaton challenge, a gigaton of carbon reduction for its customers. So it's been helping its customers decarbonizing. That's its game plan, and they've been hugely successful. So that's one example, but sadly, they're not many, certainly in publicly held U.S. companies.
And I kind of want to bring this kind of full circle, I guess, back to, you introduced the book and kind of broadly what your intent was behind that. But what would success of the book look like to you? In terms of what it might affect and what it might change?
Well, I think if I think about the desired audiences for the book, I would love for every corporate board member to have this book and to read it. And it's interesting. One of the things I've learned over the years, you mentioned that I reported to many boards. That was especially during the years of running environmental health safety auditing in the U.S. I was essentially the equivalent of the Big Four audit partner going to the audit committee of a company. I was the partner in charge of the environmental health safety programs going to the corporate responsibility committee of the board, or equivalent, whatever the name was, essentially blessing the environmental programs. So it was interesting to see how boards think. But one of the things I learned is boards typically don't tell CEOs what to do. They are most powerful when they ask questions, when they ask thoughtful questions. And I have a chapter in the book, one chapter about boards evaluating themselves and another on questions to ask. But one of the things I've learned is, board members talk to board members. That's where they learn. And so ideally, this book penetrates some boardrooms and expands out from there. And I think a second key audience would be business schools. I mean, any young professional in business school who wants to change the world, especially Gen Z types, I would hope that this could be their roadmap as well.
And preempting the magic wand, which we'll come on to in a second, I'm basically giving you two bites of the cherry here, which I don't normally do. But if thinking about both of those audiences, what would be the absolute cornerstone takeaway that you'd like them to leave with, having read your book?
Let me say one thing about the book is that I mentioned that there's an appendix of the book titled The Climate Story. And when I was writing the book, I wanted to tell the climate situation to busy execs in a few pages. And I met an amazing woman, UK colleague. Her name is Lucy Carmody. She is ex-Wall Street, lived around the world, a climate expert. She helped enormously with the book and then ended up co-authoring the Climate Story appendix with me. And the further we got into it, the more we decided to carve it out and put it as a separate website. So theclimatestory.com with hyphens, the-climate-story.com has the climate story in 8 sequential steps, each of which has data on long-term trends, recent trends, and next 5 years, and essentially maps out the situation today. And so there's one takeaway that I learned with Lucy from the data, and it's just about the data. It's that things are really bad now. And it's accelerating. It's not just the data is not just straight line data. It starts with energy demand, then goes to CO2, then goes to air temperature rise, then ocean temperature, then sea level rise, then storms, then insurance industry reacting, then capital markets. So those are the 8 steps. And we know what's happening with energy demand. We know what's happening with CO2. Air temperature rise is accelerating significantly. And so the takeaway I hope people have is, holy moly, I could say that in other words, things are really bad. And if we look at the data, there's not a lot of chance it's going to get way better in the next 25 years, which brings me back to the article, Charlie. This is the most, interesting and exciting storyline that I've read, certainly since I was doing the research on the book, which ended last year. So very positive on that regard.
Very much so, Gib. And I love the fact that we've managed to find, it's not often that you find in our world a positive story. And I take your point from earlier, like there are considerations around kind of the wider context of what's going on with air quality and coal production, etc. But even in itself, it's a positive story to hold on to. I have to admit, I think you've got the next title for your follow-up book, by the way.
Yeah.
Which should start with something like "Holy moly, holy moly." I think that would land.
I'm conscious of the potential audience here, Charlie.
I love it. Now, Gib, let's. I know that was a whistle-stop tour through the article and associated kind of themes, but I want to conclude now by asking you the magic wand question. If you had a magic wand and you had a way of using that magic wand to ultimately address some of the big issues at play that we've been discussing, what would you do with it?
So if I had a magic wand, I would find a way to simultaneously target 3 big audiences. So think of it as 3 waves of activity that somehow happen at the same time in 3 very distinct audiences that converge and kind of change the world. So who are the 3 audiences? One would be just broadly defined as kind of leaders, corporate leaders, government leaders, the major kind of influencers in society. Mm-hmm. Second audience in this state, we'd call it, kitchen table conversationalists, the broad middle economically in terms of people who are perhaps struggling to pay the bills, facing rising insurance costs, floods, etc. And the third audience is Gen Z. The first generation to truly grow up with climate change, and honestly, the last generation to be able to do anything, realistically about it. So those are the 3 audiences. Somehow have a series of trigger events which cause waves of activity on each of those 3. And we could imagine different trigger events, whether it's, on Gen Z, whether it's the rise of Greta Thunberg. I haven't pronounced that the correct way, but Greta 2.0, an amazing young woman who influenced Davos over the last, 8 or 10 years, somewhere in the West, in this country, Greta 2.0, and a social media explosion that just changes the conversation among Gen Z. And I should back up and say that in each of those audiences, if the waves could impact procurement, right? And by procurement, I mean buying stuff. So 70% of GDP, at least in this country, is driven by people consuming, the public consumption of goods and services. So if somehow Gen Z mass media explosion forced a change in buying bottled water, buying plastics, whatever it is, simultaneously, kitchen table discussion. I'm struck, at least in this country, Charlie, that everything we've been talking about with renewables, solar and wind, there's just this stark contrast between the Trump approach and the red states where wind and solar are proliferating. I mean, Texas is the largest consumer of solar and wind in this country, and yet and many of the red states are ones that are fighting, are kind of pro-Trump, but they're the beneficiaries of all this China renewables conversation. And then the third audience, I think this article and the China story can grab the attention of the leaders, that first group I mentioned, and hopefully flip a switch that says, if we don't change our stripes here, we're going to be left in the dust. So somehow three ways, each confronting those three different audiences, triggered by any combination of events, would be my magic wand.
Well, Gib, you're very lucky that this is a particularly magic wand, because what you've just described there is, I think, the most vastly sort of affecting magic wand suggestion that we've ever had on the show. So that was a very, very well positioned and a good usage of it. I think it's fascinating hearing you discuss that. I think if I understood you correctly, that whole idea that, Gen Z might have some more significantly influential influencers to follow that are raising awareness of these issues. If leaders of influential organizations or governments, etc., are able to appreciate and understand what's going on in China, for an example, and be inspired to change. And then finally, if there can be some sort of consensus that we can enable at a kind of a kitchen table conversationalist level, so that there isn't so much of that polarized politicization of these themes. Is that what we're saying would be the kind of the three-pronged attack, if you like, to a change in mindset, attitudes, and behavior?
I think that's right, Charlie. And I'm a half full kind of guy. The optimist in me recalls a couple of situations in history when an event that on the surface may seem quite small and insignificant actually did have a massive effect. And, there's a story in 1966 of DDT resulting in Long Island and outside New York City in reduction of the osprey population. And a small group of people sued the local mosquito commission. I mean, not exactly the Department of Energy, right? And it had a massive impact locally. The lawsuit was ultimately kicked out, but it changed the whole conversation. DDT was banned. Osprey populations, exploded afterwards. And similarly with the bald eagle in this country. So there's stories where seemingly small events can kind of, quote, change the world. And let's be hopeful that's going to happen.
Here, Gib. You're going to get your first here of the show. I couldn't concur with you more. That's a very positive note to finish on. But thank you so much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Great, Charlie. Been wonderful chatting with you.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to Gib Hedstrom for joining me on today's show. This episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability claims. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.